Welcome in. Let's have a story. This is the first video in a series of videos of a book called To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. In the description, you'll find a link to a playlist of all the videos in this series, along with timestamps if you want to skip straight to the reading. If you aren't familiar with Virginia Woolf, know that her writing style is a little unusual. She doesn't use traditional narration or dialogue, but instead she puts you inside the minds of the characters and lets you listen in on their stream of consciousness. So sometimes it jumps around in strange ways, which is meant to reflect the way the characters' thoughts jump around. The book, To the Lighthouse, is in 3 parts. Each part has several chapters. The first part is called The Window. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Yes, of course, if it's fine tomorrow, said Mrs. Ramsay, but you'll have to be up with the lark, she added. To her son, these words conveyed an extraordinary joy, as if it were settled the expedition were bound to take place, and the wonder to which he had looked forward for years and years, it seemed, was, after a night's darkness and a day's sail, within touch. Since he belonged, even at the age of 6, to that great clan which cannot keep this feeling separate from that, but must let future prospects, with their joys and sorrows, cloud what is actually at hand, since to such people, even in their earliest childhood, any turn in the wheel of sensation has the power to crystallize and transfix the moment upon which its gloom or radiance rests. James Ramsay, sitting on the floor, cutting out pictures from the illustrated catalog of the Army and Navy stores, endowed the picture of a refrigerator, as his mother spoke, with heavenly bliss. It was fringed with joy. The wheelbarrow, the lawnmower, the sound of poplar trees, leaves whitening before rain, rooks cawing, brooms knocking, dresses rustling, all these were so colored and distinguished in his mind that he had already his private code, his secret language, though he appeared the image of stark and uncompromising severity, with his high forehead and his fierce blue eyes, impeccably candid and pure, frowning slightly at the sight of human frailty, so that his mother, watching him guide his scissors neatly round the refrigerator, imagined him all red and ermine on the bench, or directing a stern and momentous enterprise in some crisis of public affairs. But, said his father, stopping in front of the drawing room window, it won't be fine. Had there been an axe handy, a poker, or any weapon that would have gashed a hole in his father's breast and killed him there and then, James would have seized it. Such were the extremes of emotion that Mr. Ramsay excited in his children's breast by his mere presence. Standing, as now, lean as a knife, narrow as the blade of one, grinning sarcastically, not only with the pleasure of disillusioning his son and casting ridicule upon his wife, who was 10,000 times better in every way than he was, or so James thought, but also with some secret conceit at his own accuracy of judgment. Whatever he said was true. It was always true. He was incapable of untruth, never tampered with a fact, never altered a disagreeable word to suit the pleasure or convenience of any mortal being, least of all his own children, who, sprung from his loins, should be aware from childhood that life is difficult, facts uncompromising, and the passage to that fabled land where our brightest hopes are extinguished, our frail barks founder in the darkness. Here, Mr. Ramsay would straighten his back and narrow his little blue eyes upon the horizon. One that needs above all courage, truth, and the power to endure. But it may be fine. I expect it will be fine, said Mrs. Ramsay, making some little twist of the reddish-brown stocking she was knitting impatiently. If she finished it tonight, if they did go to the lighthouse after all, it was to be given to the lighthouse keeper for his little boy, who was threatened with a tuberculosis hip, together with a pile of old magazines and some tobacco. Indeed, whatever she could find lying about, not really wanted, but only littering the room, to give to those poor fellows who must be bored to death, sitting all day with nothing to do but polish the lamp and trim the wick and rake about on their scrap of garden, something to amuse them. For how would you like to be shut up for a whole month at a time, and possibly more in stormy weather, upon a rock the size of a tennis lawn, she would ask, and to have no letters or newspapers, and to see nobody? If you were married, not to see your wife, not to know how your children were, if they were ill, if they had fallen down and broken their legs or arms, to see the same dreary waves breaking week after week, and then a dreadful storm coming and the windows covered with spray, and birds dashed against the lamp, and the whole place rocking, and not be able to put your nose out of doors for fear of being swept into the sea. How would you like that? She asked, addressing herself particularly to her daughters. So she added, rather differently, one must take them whatever comforts one can. It's due west, said the atheist Tansley, holding his bony fingers spread so that the wind blew through them, for he was sharing Mr. Ramsay's evening walk up and down the terrace. That is to say, the wind blew from the worst possible direction for landing at the lighthouse. Yes, he did say disagreeable things, Mrs. Ramsay admitted. It was odious of him to rub this in, to make James still more disappointed. But at the same time, she would not let them laugh at him. The atheist, they called him, the little atheist. Rose mocked him, Prue mocked him, Andrew, Jasper, Roger mocked him. Even old Badger, without a tooth in his head, had bid him for being, as Nancy put it, the 110th young man to chase them all the way up to the Hebrides, when it was ever so much nicer to be alone. Nonsense, said Mrs. Ramsay with great severity. Apart from the habit of exaggeration which they had from her, and from the implication, which was true, that she asked too many people to stay and had to lodge some in the town, she could not bear incivility to her guests, to young men in particular, who were poor as church mice. Exceptionally able, her husband said, his great admirers, and come there for a holiday. Indeed, she had the whole of the other sex under her protection, for reasons she could not explain, for their chivalry and valor, for the fact that they negotiated treaties, ruled India, controlled finance, finally for an attitude towards herself which no woman could fail to feel or to find agreeable, something trustful, childlike, reverential, which an old woman could take from a young man without loss of dignity. And woe betide the girl, pray heaven it was none of her daughters, who did not feel the worth of it, and all that it implied, to the marrow of her bones. She turned with severity upon Nancy. He had not chased them, she said. He had been asked. They must find a way out of it all. There might be some simpler way, some less laborious way, she sighed. When she looked in the glass and saw her hair gray, her cheek sunk at 50, she thought possibly she might have managed things better. Her husband, money, his books. But for her own part, she would never for a single second regret her decision, evade difficulties, or slur over duties. She was now formidable to behold, and it was only in silence, looking up from their plates, after she had spoken so severely about Charles Tansley, that her daughters, Prue, Nancy, Rose, could sport with infidel ideas which they had brewed for themselves of a life different from hers. In Paris, perhaps, a wilder life, not always taking care of some man or another, for there was in all their minds a mute questioning of deference and chivalry, of the Bank of England and the Indian Empire, of ringed fingers and lace, though to them all there was something in this of the essence of beauty, which called out the manliness in their girlish hearts, and made them, as they sat at table beneath their mother's eyes, honor her strange severity, her extreme courtesy, like a queen's raising from the mud to wash a beggar's dirty foot, when she admonished them so very severely about that wretched atheist who had chased them, or, speaking accurately, been invited to stay with them in the Isle of Skye. "There will be no landing at the lighthouse tomorrow," said Charles Tansley, clapping his hands together as he stood at the window with her husband. Surely he had said enough. She wished they would both leave her and James alone and go on talking. She looked at him. He was such a miserable specimen, the children said, all humps and hollows. He couldn't play cricket. He poked. He shuffled. He was a sarcastic brute, Andrew said. They knew what he liked best, to be forever walking up and down with Mr. Ramsay, and saying who had won this and who had won that, who was a first-rate man at Latin verses, who was brilliant, but I think fundamentally unsound, who was undoubtedly the ablest fellow in Balliol, who had buried his light temporarily at Bristol or Bedford, but was bound to be heard of later when his prolegomena, of which Mr. Tansley had the first pages in proof with him, if Mr. Ramsay would like to see them, to some branch of mathematics or philosophy, saw the light of day. That was what they talked about. She could not help laughing herself sometimes. She said the other day something about waves mountains high. Yes, said Charles Tansley, it was a little rough. Aren't you drenched to the skin? She had said. Damp, not wet though, said Mr. Tansley, pinching his sleeve, feeling his socks. But it was not that they minded, the children said. It was not his face, it was not his manners, it was him, his point of view. When they talked about something interesting, people, music, history, anything, even said that it was a fine evening, so why not sit out of doors? Then what they complained of about Charles Tansley was that until he had turned the whole thing round and made it somehow reflect himself and disparage them, he was not satisfied. And he would go to picture galleries, they said, and he would ask one, did one like his tie? God knows, said Rose, one did not. Disappearing as stealthily as stags from the dinner table, directly the meal was over, the 8 sons and daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay sought their bedrooms, their fastness in a house where there was no other privacy to debate anything, everything. Tansley's tie, the passing of the Reform Bill, seabirds and butterflies, people, while the sun poured into those attics which a plank alone separated from each other so that every footstep could be plainly heard, and the Swiss girl sobbing for her father, who was dying of cancer in a valley of the Grisons, and lit up the bats, flannels, straw hats, ink pots, paint pots, beetles, and the skulls of small birds, while it drew from the long, frilled strips of seaweed pinned to the wall a smell of salt and weeds, which was in the towels too, gritty with sand from bathing. Strife, divisions, difference of opinion, prejudices, twisted into the very fiber of being. Oh, that they should begin so early, Mrs. Ramsay deplored. They were so critical, her children. They talked such nonsense. She went from the dining room, holding James by the hand since he would not go with the others. It seemed to her such nonsense, inventing differences when people, heaven knows, were different enough without that. The real differences, she thought, standing by the drawing-room window, are enough, quite enough. She had in mind, at that moment, rich and poor, high and low, the great in birth, receiving from her, half grudging, some respect. For had she not in her veins the blood of that very noble, if slightly mythical Italian house, whose daughters, scattered about English drawing-rooms in the 19th century, had lisped so charmingly, had stormed so wildly, and all her wit and her bearing and her temper came from them, and not from the sluggish English or the cold Scotch. But more profoundly, she ruminated the other problem of rich and poor, and the things she saw with her own eyes weekly, daily, here or in London, when she visited this window, or that struggling wife in person with a bag on her arm, and a notebook and a pencil which she wrote down in columns, carefully ruled for the purpose, wages and spendings, employment and unemployment, in the hope that thus she would cease to be a private woman whose charity was half a sop to her own indignation, half a relief to her own curiosity, and become what, with her untrained mind, she greatly admired, an investigator elucidating the social problem. Insoluble questions they were, it seemed to her, standing there holding James by the hand. He had followed her into the drawing room, that young man they laughed at. He was standing by the table, fidgeting with something, awkwardly, feeling himself out of things, as she knew without looking round. They had all gone, the children, Minta Doyle and Paul Rayleigh, Augustus Carmichael, her husband, they had all gone. So she turned with a sigh and said, "Would it bore you to come with me, Mr. Tansley?" She had a dull errand in the town. She had a letter or two to write. She would be 10 minutes, perhaps. She would put on her hat. And with her basket and her parasol, there she was again, 10 minutes later, giving out a sense of being ready, of being equipped for a jaunt, which, however, she must interrupt for a moment, as they passed the tennis lawn, to ask Mr. Carmichael, who was basking with his yellow cat's eyes ajar, so that, like a cat's, they seemed to reflect the branches moving or the clouds passing, but to give no inkling of any inner thoughts or emotion whatsoever, if he wanted anything. For they were making the great expedition, she said, laughing. They were going to the town. Stamps, writing paper, tobacco, she suggested, stopping by his side. But no, he wanted nothing. His hands clasped themselves over his capacious paunch. His eyes blinked as if he would have liked to reply kindly to these blandishments. She was seductive, but a little nervous, but could not, sunk as he was in a gray-green somnolence which embraced them all, without need of words, in a vast and benevolent lethargy of well-wishing. All the house, all the world, all the people in it, for he had slipped into his glass at lunch a few drops of something, which accounted, the children thought, for the vivid streak of canary yellow in mustache and beard that were otherwise milk white. "No, nothing," he murmured. "He should have been a great philosopher," said Mrs. Ramsay, as they went down the road to the fishing village. "But he had made an unfortunate marriage." Holding her black parasol very erect and moving with an indescribable air of expectation, as if she were going to meet someone round the corner, she told the story, an affair at Oxford with some girl, an early marriage, poverty, going to India, translating a little poetry, very beautifully, I believe, being willing to teach the boys Persian or Hindustani, But what really was the use of that? And then lying as they saw him on the lawn. It flattered him, snubbed as he had been. It soothed him that Mrs. Ramsay should tell him this. Charles Tansley revived, insinuating too, as she did, the greatness of man's intellect, even in its decay, the subjection of all wives. Not that she blamed the girl, and the marriage had been happy enough, she believed, to their husband's labors. She made him feel better pleased with himself than he had done yet. He would have liked, had they taken a cab, for example, to have paid the fare. As for her little bag, might he not carry that? No, no, she said. She always carried that herself. She did, too. Yes, he felt that in her. He felt many things. Something in particular that excited him and disturbed him for reasons which he could not give. He would like her to see him, gowned and hooded, walking in a procession, a fellowship, a professorship. He felt capable of anything and saw himself. But what was she looking at? At a man pasting a bill. The vast flapping sheet flattened itself out, and each shove of the brush revealed fresh legs, hoops, horses, glistening reds and blues, beautifully smooth, until half the wall was covered with the advertisement of a circus. 100 horsemen, 20 performing seals, lions, tigers. Craning forwards, for she was short-sighted, she read it out. "We'll visit this town," she read. It was terribly dangerous work for a one-armed man, she exclaimed, to stand on top of a ladder like that. His left arm had been cut off in a reaping machine 2 years ago. "Let us all go," she cried, moving on as if all those riders and horses had filled her with childlike exultation and made her forget her pity. "Let's go," he said, repeating her words, clicking them out, however, with a self-consciousness that made her wince. "Let us all go to the circus." No, he could not say it right. He could not feel it right, but why not, she wondered. What was wrong with him then? She liked him warmly at the moment. Had they not been taken, she asked, to circuses when they were children? "Never," he answered, as if she asked the very thing he wanted, had been longing all these days to say, how they did not go to circuses. It was a large family, 9 brothers and sisters, and his father was a working man. "My father is a chemist, Mrs. Ramsay. He keeps a shop." He himself had paid his own way since he was 13. Often he went without a greatcoat in winter. He could never return hospitality. Those were his parched, stiff words at college. He had to make things last twice the time that other people did. He smoked the cheapest tobacco, shag, the same the old men did in the quays. He worked hard, 7 hours a day. His subject was now the influence of something upon somebody. They were walking on, and Mrs. Ramsay did not quite catch the meaning, only the words, here and there. Dissertation, fellowship, readership, lectureship. She could not follow the ugly academic jargon that rattled itself off so glibly, but said to herself that she saw now why going to the circus had knocked him off his perch, poor man, and why he came out instantly with all that about his father and mother and brothers and sisters, and she would see to it that they didn't laugh at him anymore, she would tell Prue about it. What he would have liked, she supposed, would have been to say how he had gone not to the circus, but to Ibsen with the Ramsays. He was such an awful prig. Oh yes, an insufferable bore. For though they had reached the town now and were in the main street with carts grinding past on the cobbles, still he went on talking about settlements and teaching and working men and helping our own class and lectures, till she gathered that he had got back entire self-confidence, had recovered from the circus, and was about, and now again she liked him warmly, to tell her. But here the houses falling away on both sides, they came out on the quay, and the whole bay spread before them, and Mrs. Ramsay could not help exclaiming, "Oh, how beautiful!" For the great plateful of blue water was before her, the hoary lighthouse distant, austere in the midst, and on the right, as far as the eye could see, fading and falling in soft, low pleats, the green sand dunes with the wild, flowing grasses on them, which always seemed to be running away into some moon country uninhabited of men. That was the view, she said, stopping, growing grayer-eyed, that her husband loved. She paused a moment. But now, she said, artists had come here. There, indeed, only a few paces off, stood one of them, in Panama hat and yellow boots, seriously, softly, absorbedly, for all that he was watched by 10 little boys with an air of profound contentment on his red, round face, gazing. And then, when he had gazed, dipping, imbuing the tip of his brush in some soft mound of green or pink. Since Mr. Pauncefort had been there 3 years before, all the pictures were like that, she said, green and gray, with lemon-colored sailing boats, and pink women on the beach. But her grandmother's friends, she said, glancing discreetly as they passed, took the greatest pains. First they mixed their own colors, and then they ground them, and then they put damp cloths to keep them moist. So Mr. Tansley supposed she meant him to see that that man's picture was skimpy. Was that what one said? The colors weren't solid. Was that what one said? Under the influence of that extraordinary emotion which had been growing all the walk, had begun in the garden when he had wanted to take her back, had increased in the town when he had wanted to tell her everything about himself. He was coming to see himself and everything he had ever known gone crooked a little. It was awfully strange. There he stood in the parlor of the poky little house where she had taken him, waiting for her while she went upstairs a moment to see a woman. He heard her quick step above, heard her voice cheerful, then low, and looked at the mats, tea caddies, glass shades, waited quite impatiently, looked forward eagerly to the walk home, determined to carry her bag, and heard her come out, shut a door, say they must keep the windows open and the doors shut, ask at the house for anything they wanted. She must be talking to a child, when suddenly in she came, stood for a moment silent, as if she had been pretending up there, and for a moment let herself be now, stood quite motionless for a moment against the picture of Queen Victoria wearing the blue ribbon of the garter, when all at once he realized that it was this. She was the most beautiful person he had ever seen. With stars in her eyes and veils in her hair, with cyclamen and wild violets. What nonsense was he thinking? She was 50 at least. She had 8 children. Stepping through fields of flowers and taking to her breast buds that had been broken and lambs that had fallen. With the stars in her eyes and the wind in her hair, he had hold of her bag. "Goodbye, Elsie," she said, and they walked up the street, she holding her parasol erect, while for the first time in his life, Charles Tansley felt an extraordinary pride. A man digging in a drain stopped digging and looked at her, let his arm fall down and looked at her. For the first time in his life, Charles Tansley felt an extraordinary pride, felt the wind and the cyclamen and the violets, for he was walking with a beautiful woman. He had hold of her bag. That was the end of chapter 1. So, scene 2. "No going to the lighthouse, James," he said, as trying, in deference to Mrs. Ramsay, to soften his voice into some semblance of geniality at least. Odious little man, thought Mrs. Ramsay. Why go on saying that? Scene 3. "Perhaps you will wake up and find the sun shining and the birds singing," she said compassionately, smoothing the little boy's hair. For her husband, with his caustic saying that it would not be fine, had dashed his spirits. She could see. This going to the lighthouse was a passion of his, she saw. And then, as if her husband had not said enough, with his caustic saying that it would not be fine tomorrow, this odious little man went and rubbed it in all over again. "Perhaps it will be fine tomorrow," she said, smoothing his hair. All she could do now was to admire the refrigerator and turn the pages of the stores list in the hope that she might come upon something like a rake or a mowing machine which, with its prongs and its handles, would need the greatest skill and care in cutting out. All these young men parodied her husband, she reflected. He said it would rain. They said it would be a positive tornado. But here, as she turned the page, suddenly her search for a picture of a rake or a mowing machine was interrupted. The gruff murmur, irregularly broken by the taking out of pipes and the putting in of pipes, which had kept on assuring her, though she could not hear what was said as she sat in the window which opened on the terrace, that the men were happily talking. This sound, which had lasted now half an hour, and had taken its place soothingly in the scale of sounds pressing on top of her, such as the tap of balls upon bats, the sharp, sudden bark now and then. "How's that? How's that?" of the children playing cricket had ceased, so that the monotonous fall of the waves on the beach, which for the most part beat a measured and soothing tattoo to her thoughts, and seemed consolingly to repeat over and over again as she sat with the children the words of some old cradle song, murmured by nature. I am guarding you, I am your support. But at other times, suddenly and unexpectedly, especially when her mind raised itself slightly from the task actually in hand, had no such kindly meaning, but like a ghostly roll of drums remorselessly beat the measure of life, made one think of the destruction of the island and its engulfment in the sea, and warned her whose day had slipped past in one quick doing after another that it was all ephemeral as a rainbow. This sound, which had been obscured and concealed under the other sounds, suddenly thundered hollow in her ears and made her look up with an impulse of terror. They had ceased to talk. That was the explanation, falling in 1 second from the tension which had gripped her to the other extreme, which, as if to recoup her for her unnecessary expense of emotion, was cool, amused, and even faintly malicious. She concluded that poor Charles Tansley had been shed. That was of little account to her. If her husband required sacrifices, and indeed he did, she cheerfully offered up to him Charles Tansley, who had snubbed her little boy. One moment more, with her head raised, she listened, as if she waited for some habitual sound, some regular, mechanical sound, and then, hearing something rhythmical, half said, half chanted, beginning in the garden, as her husband beat up and down the terrace, something between a croak and a song, she was soothed once more, assured again that all was well, and looking down at the book on her knee, found the picture of a pocket knife with 6 blades, which could only be cut out if James was very careful. Suddenly, a loud cry, as of a sleepwalker half roused, something about, stormed at with shot and shell, sung out with the utmost intensity in her ear, made her turn apprehensively to see if anyone had heard him. Only Lily Briscoe, she was glad to find, and that did not matter. But the sight of the girl standing on the edge of the lawn, painting, reminded her she was supposed to be keeping her head as much in the same position as possible for Lily's picture. Lily's picture. Mrs. Ramsay smiled. With her little Chinese eyes and her puckered-up face, she would never marry. One could not take her painting very seriously. She was an independent little creature, and Mrs. Ramsay liked her for it. So, remembering her promise, she bent her head. Scene 4. Indeed, he almost knocked her easel over, coming down upon her with his hands waving, shouting out, "Boldly we rode and well." But mercifully he turned sharp and rode off, to die gloriously, she supposed, upon the heights of Balaclava. Never was anybody at once so ridiculous and so alarming, but so long as he kept like that, waving, shouting, she was safe. He would not stand still and look at her picture. And that was what Lily Briscoe could not have endured. Even while she looked at the mass, at the line, at the color, at Mrs. Ramsay sitting in the window with James, she kept a feeler on her surroundings, lest someone should creep up, and suddenly she should find her picture looked at. But now, with all her senses quickened as they were, looking, straining, till the color of the wall and the jacmana beyond burnt into her eyes, she was aware of someone coming out of the house, coming towards her, but somehow divined from the footfall William Banks, so that though her brush quivered, she did not, and as she would have done had it been Mr. Tansley, Paul Rayleigh, Minta Doyle, or practically anybody else, turn her canvas upon the grass, but let it stand. William Banks stood beside her. They had rooms in the village, and so, walking in, walking out, parting late on doormats, had said little things about the soup, about the children, about one thing and another which made them allies, so that when he stood beside her now in his judicial way, he was old enough to be her father too, a botanist, a widower, smelling of soap, very scrupulous and clean. She just stood there. He just stood there. Her shoes were excellent, he observed. They allowed the toes their natural expansion. Lodging in the same house with her, he had noticed too how orderly she was, and without the complexion or the allurement of Miss Doyle, certainly, but with a good sense which made her, in his eyes, superior to that young lady. Now, for instance, when Ramsay bore down on them, shouting, gesticulating, Miss Briscoe, he felt certain, understood. Someone had blundered. Mr. Ramsay glared at them. He glared at them without seeming to see them. That did make them both vaguely uncomfortable. Together they had seen a thing they had not been meant to see. Together they had seen a thing. Together they had encroached upon a privacy. So, Lily thought, it was probably an excuse of his for moving, for getting out of earshot, that made Mr. Banks almost immediately say something about it being chilly and suggested taking a stroll. She would come, yes, but it was with difficulty that she took her eyes off her picture. The jacmana was bright violet, the wall staring white. She would not have considered it honest to tamper with the bright violet and the staring white, since she saw them like that, fashionable though it was, since Mr. Pauncefort's visit to see everything pale, elegant, semi-transparent. Then beneath the color there was the shape. She could see it all so clearly, so commandingly when she looked. It was when she took her brush in hand that the whole thing changed. It was in that moment's flight between the picture and her canvas that the demons set on her, who often brought her to the verge of tears and made this passage from conception to work as dreadful as any down a dark passage for a child. Such she often felt herself, struggling against terrific odds to maintain her courage, to say, but this is what I see, this is what I see. and so to clasp some miserable remnant of her vision to her breast, which 1,000 forces did their best to pluck from her. It was then, too, in that chill and windy way, as she began to paint, that there forced themselves upon her other things, her own inadequacy, her insignificance, keeping house for her father off the Brompton Road, and had much ado to control her impulse to fling herself, thank heaven she had always resisted so far, at Mrs. Ramsay's knee and say to her, but what would one say to her? I'm in love with you. No, that was not true. I'm in love with this all, waving her hand at the hedge, at the house, at the children. It was absurd. It was impossible. So now, when she laid her brushes neatly in the box, side by side, and said to William Banks, "It suddenly gets cold. The sun seems to give less heat," she said, looking about her, for it was bright enough. The grass still a soft, deep green. The house starred in its greenery with purple passion flowers, and rooks dripping cool cries from the high blue. But something moved, flashed, turned a silver wing in the air. It was September, after all, the middle of September, and past 6 in the evening. So off they strolled down the garden in the usual direction, past the tennis lawn, past the pampas grass, to that break in the thick hedge, guarded by red-hot bogers like braziers of clear burning coal, between which the blue waters of the bay looked bluer than ever. They came there regularly every evening, drawn by some need. It was as if the water floated off and set sailing thoughts which had grown stagnant on dry land, and gave to their bodies even some sort of physical relief. First, the pulse of color flooded the bay with blue, and the heart expanded with it, and the body swam, only the next instant to be checked and chilled by the prickly blackness on the ruffled waves. Then up behind the great black rock, almost every evening spurted irregularly, so that one had to watch for it, and it was a delight when it came. A fountain of white water, and then, while one waited for that, one watched, on the pale, semicircular beach, wave after wave, shedding again and again, smoothly, a film of mother of pearl. They both smiled, standing there. They both felt a common hilarity, excited by the morning waves, and then by the swift cutting race of a sailing boat, which, having sliced a curve in the bay, stopped, shivered, let its sails drop down, and then, with a natural instinct to complete the picture, after this swift movement, both of them looked at the dunes far away, and instead of merriment, felt come over them some sadness, because the thing was completed partly, and partly because distant views seemed to outlast by 1,000,000 years, Lily thought, the gazer, and to be communing already with a sky which beholds an earth entirely at rest. Looking at the far sand hills, William Banks thought of Ramsay, thought of a road in Westmoreland, thought of Ramsay striding along a road by himself, hung round with that solitude which seemed to be his natural air. But this was suddenly interrupted, William Banks remembered, and this must refer to some actual incident, by a hen straddling her wings out in protection of a covey of little chicks, upon which Ramsay, stopping, pointed his stick and said, "Pretty, pretty." An odd illumination in his heart. Banks had thought it, which showed his simplicity, his sympathy with humble things, but it seemed to him as if their friendship had ceased there on that stretch of road. After that, Ramsay had married. After that, what with one thing and another, the pulp had gone out of their friendship. Whose fault it was he could not say, only after a time repetition had taken the place of newness. It was to repeat that they met. But in this dumb colloquy with the sand dunes, he maintained that his affection for Ramsay had in no way diminished, but there, like the body of a young man laid up in peat for a century, with the red fresh on his lips, was his friendship in its acuteness and reality, laid up across the bay among the sandhills. He was anxious for the sake of this friendship, and perhaps too in order to clear himself in his own mind from the imputation of having dried and shrunk. For Ramsay lived in a welter of children, whereas Banks was childless and a widower. He was anxious that Lily Briscoe should not disparage Ramsay, a great man, in his own way, yet should understand how things stood between them. Begun long years ago, their friendship had petered out on a Westmoreland road, where the hen spread her wings before her chicks, after which Ramsay had married, and their paths lying different ways, there had been, certainly for no one's fault, some tendency, when they met, to repeat. Yes, that was it. He finished. He turned from the view, and turning to walk back the other way up the drive, Mr. Banks was alive to things which would not have struck him had not those sandhills revealed to him the body of his friendship lying with the red on its lips laid up in peat. For instance, Cam, the little girl, Ramsay's youngest daughter, she was picking Sweet Alice on the bank. She was wild and fierce. She would not give a flower to the gentleman, as the nursemaid told her. No, 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 she would not. She clenched her fist. She stamped. And Mr. Banks felt aged and saddened, and somehow put into the wrong by her about his friendship. He must have died and shrunk. The Ramsays were not rich, and it was a wonder how they managed to contrive it all. 8 children, to feed 8 children on philosophy. Here was another of them, Jasper this time, strolling past, to have a shot at a bird. He said, nonchalantly, swinging Lily's hand like a pump handle as he passed, which caused Mr. Banks to say bitterly how she was a favorite. There was education now to be considered. True, Mrs. Ramsay had something of her own, perhaps, let alone the daily wear and tear of shoes and stockings, which those great fellows, all well-grown, angular, ruthless youngsters, must require. As for being sure which was which, or in what order they came, that was beyond him. He called them privately after the kings and queens of England, Cam the wicked, James the ruthless, Andrew the just, Prue the fair, for Prue would have beauty, he thought. How could she help it? And Andrew brains. While he walked up the drive, and Lily Briscoe said yes and no and capped his comments, for she was in love with them all, in love with this world. He weighed Ramsay's case, commiserated him, envied him, as if he had seen him divest himself of all those glories of isolation and austerity which crowned him in youth, to cumber himself definitely with fluttering wings and clucking domesticities. They gave him something. William Banks acknowledged that. It would have been pleasant if Cam had stuck a flower in his coat or clambered over his shoulder, as over her father's, to look at a picture of Vesuvius in eruption. But they had also, his old friends could not but feel, destroyed something. What would a stranger think now? What did this Lily Briscoe think? Could one help noticing that habits grew on him, eccentricities, weaknesses, perhaps? It was astonishing that a man of his intellect could stoop so low as he did. But that was too harsh a phrase. Could depend so much as he did upon people's praise. Oh, but, said Lily, think of his work. Whenever she thought of his work, she always saw clearly before her a large kitchen table. It was Andrew's doing. She asked him what his father's books were about. Subject and object and the nature of reality, Andrew had said. And when she said heavens, she had no notion of what that meant. Think of a kitchen table, then, he told her, when you're not there. So now she always saw, when she thought of Mr. Ramsay's work, a scrubbed kitchen table. It lodged now in the fork of a pear tree, for they had reached the orchard, and with a painful effort of concentration she focused her mind, not upon the silver-bossed bark of the tree or upon its fish-shaped leaves, but upon a phantom kitchen table, one of those scrubbed board tables, grained and knotted, whose virtue seems to have been laid bare by years of muscular integrity, which stuck there, its four legs in the air. Naturally, if one's days were passed in this seeing of angular essences, this reducing of lovely evenings with all their flamingo clouds and blue and silver, to a white deal four-legged table, and it was a mark of the finest minds to do so. Naturally, one could not be judged like an ordinary person. Mr. Banks liked her forbidding him think of his work. He had thought of it, and often, times without number, he had said. Ramsay is one of those men who do their best work before they are 40. he had made a definite contribution to philosophy in one little book when he was only 5 and 20. What came after that was more or less amplification, repetition, but the number of men who make a definite contribution to anything whatsoever is very small, he said, pausing by the pear tree, well brushed, scrupulously exact, exquisitely judicial. Suddenly, as if the movement of his hand had released it, the load of her accumulated impressions of him tilted up, and down poured in a ponderous avalanche all she felt about him. That was one sensation. Then rose up in a fume the essence of his being. That was another. She felt herself transfixed by the intensity of her perception. It was his severity, his goodness. I respect you, she addressed silently him in the person. In every atom, you are not vain. You are entirely impersonal. You are finer than Mr. Ramsay. You are the finest human being that I know. You have neither wife nor child. Without any sexual feeling, she longed to cherish that loneliness. You live for science. Involuntarily, sections of potatoes rose before her eyes. Praise would be an insult to you, generous, pure-hearted, heroic man. But simultaneously, she remembered how he had brought a valet all the way up here, objected to dogs on chairs, would prose for hours until Mr. Ramsay slammed out of the room about salt in vegetables and the iniquity of English cooks. How then did it work out, all this? How did one judge people, think of them? How did one add up this and that and conclude that it was liking one felt or disliking? And to those words, what meaning attached, after all? Standing now, apparently transfixed by the pear tree, impressions poured in upon her of those two men, and to follow her thought was like following a voice which speaks too quickly to be taken down by one's pencil. And the voice was her own voice saying, without prompting, undeniable, everlasting, contradictory things, so that even the fissures and humps on the bark of the pear tree were irrevocably fixed there for eternity. You have greatness, she continued, but Mr. Ramsay has none of it. He is petty, selfish, vain, egotistical. He is spoilt. He is a tyrant. He wears Mrs. Ramsay to death. But he has what you, she addressed Mr. Banks, have not. A fiery unworldliness. He knows nothing about trifles. He loves dogs and his children. He has 8. Mr. Banks has none. Did he not come down in 2 coats the other night and let Mrs. Ramsay trim his hair into a pudding basin? All of this danced up and down like a company of gnats, each separate but all marvelously controlled in an invisible elastic net. Danced up and down in Lily's mind, in and about the branches of the pear tree, where still hung in effigy the scrubbed kitchen table, symbol of her profound respect for Mr. Ramsay's mind, until her thought, which had spun quicker and quicker, exploded of its own intensity. She felt released, a shot went off, close at hand, and there came, flying from its fragments, frightened, effusive, tumultuous, a flock of starlings. "Jasper," said Mr. Banks. They turned the way the starlings flew over the terrace. Following the scatter of swift flying birds in the sky, they stepped through the gap in the high hedge straight into Mr. Ramsay, who boomed tragically at them. Someone had blundered. His eyes, glazed with emotion, defiant with tragic intensity, met theirs for a second, and trembled on the verge of recognition, but then, raising his hand halfway to his face as if to avert, to brush off, in an agony of peevish shame, their normal gaze, as if he begged them to withhold for a moment what he knew to be inevitable, as if he impressed upon them his own childlike resentment of interruption. Yet even in the moment of discovery, it was not to be routed utterly, but was determined to hold fast to something of this delicious emotion, this impure rhapsody of which he was ashamed, but in which he reveled. He turned abruptly, slammed his private door on them, and Lily Briscoe and Mr. Banks, looking uneasily up into the sky, observed that the flock of starlings which Jasper had routed with his gun had settled on the tops of the elm trees. I hope you enjoyed that installment of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. There's a link to the full playlist of this book in the description. If you'd like more of this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. Until next time, goodbye.